In our first ed puzzle this week, we're going to cover just the basics of classical conditioning, which you read about in chapter 3. There are some more specific concepts at the beginning and end of chapter 3 that you'll conquer on your own through the quiz and the reading and some later discussions. And so we're just going to cover the basic terminology and how to apply those terms to examples, and then hopefully generate your own example in this ed puzzle. If by the end you don't feel like you've totally conquered classical conditioning, that's totally okay, because we're going to continue on with it next week. So this week we're just kind of diving our foot in. And as we're getting used to the textbook, you're probably also getting used to a lot of new terminology. And so behaviorism, which is the branch of psychology that involves classical conditioning and operant conditioning, which we'll cover next, has a lot of its own terms. And so there's 3 that we just kind of need to get out of the way that I believe you were introduced to in chapter 2 that we're going to use over and over and over again throughout this ed puzzle and lecture and throughout the rest of the chapters. And so we need to get used to the word stimulus, which is the singular version. Stimuli is the plural version. But basically, that's just referring to something. It's something or an event. It's essentially, if we're looking at a cause and effect, it's going to be the cause in most instances. But a stimulus is just something. On the flip side, we're also going to be talking a lot about responses. And responses are always going to be behaviors. And so usually we have a stimulus causing a response, or something causing a reaction or a behavior. So let's get used to those 2 terms. And a third that you'll also see that's not specific to behaviorism, but that we use quite a bit is elicit. And so that's pretty common in psychology, but essentially it just means to bring about or to cause something. And so throughout here, I'm going to be eliciting responses from you simply by asking you questions. And so I'm causing you to provide responses, or I'm bringing out responses in you. So those are the 3 terms. There's a lot of other terminology that was defined and also just used throughout the chapter, and you'll get used to that as we go. The first couple chapters are probably the hardest, just because you're getting used to all of the new terms. But once we learn them, we use all these terms throughout the rest of the session. And so what is classical conditioning? Hopefully, most everyone was exposed to this in at least some form in intro psychology. But the main idea behind classical conditioning is that it's developing an automatic response to a certain stimuli. And so what I'm going to keep reiterating is that this is unintentional learning. So it's just something that happens automatically. So you don't have to think about it. You don't have to put effort into it. Classical conditioning is just automatic, and it just occurs. And so when we talk about learning and use that term throughout this section, sometimes that can connotate some type of intentionality or thought that goes behind it. But classical conditioning happens without thought. It's unintentional. It just happens. It's just the result of 2 things occurring in time. And so you can think of it as like a reflexive reaction, a knee-jerk reaction to something, is a term I use quite a bit, to something that didn't initially make you respond that way. So what it really involves is generalizing a natural automatic reflex to something else that's entirely different. And so essentially you're just learning that one thing, again, learning unintentionally, that because 2 things occur in time together, they are going to end up eliciting or causing the same behavior. This will make much more sense once we break it down into examples and the terms that we became familiar with in this chapter. So one example that I always like to use, of course, are my dogs, because they're adorable. So why does my dog, or dogs, because they both do it, why do they bark at the sound of the doorbell? Well, does the sound of a doorbell naturally make a dog bark? Are puppies born automatically barking at doorbells? It may seem like the answer is yes, but the answer is no. Doorbells, or the sounds that a doorbell makes, does not automatically elicit a bark response from a dog. It doesn't naturally make a dog bark. So what does make the dog bark naturally? Puppies are born and they grow up and then they naturally bark at what that's associated with the doorbell? Well, usually dogs have evolved over time and millennium to bark at the arrival of a new person. They're signaling the presence of a new person so that you know someone is there. And so what makes the dog bark naturally is the arrival of someone, of a person, not the doorbell. And so why do they bark at the doorbell then? Well, because the doorbell and the arrival of the person occur together in time. So every time a person arrives, the doorbell also rings. And so after this happens a number of times, the dog learns and is classically conditioned to bark at the doorbell, and they don't even need to see that a person is there. They'll bark at the doorbell just on its own. And so we would say that dogs, or at least my two dogs, have been classically conditioned to bark at the doorbell. They were not born barking at doorbells, but over time they paired the doorbell with the arrival of the person, and now they just bark at the doorbell. There's a number of other examples of classical conditioning, and so the one that we read about in the book and the literal OG example of how this developed, it was incidentally discovered by Pavlov, was that his dog was drooling at the sound of a bell. Because the bell was always paired with the presentation of food. And so food automatically makes the dog drool. It's a natural response. Every time the food came out, he played a bell for the dog, and then the bell on its own began naturally eliciting this response. Okay, another similar, I also have a cat. There you go. My cat meowing at the can opener. So a can opener on its own, or the sound it makes or whatever, doesn't naturally make a cat want to meow. They wouldn't really care about the can opener, but they do care about the can opener because it's always paired with food being available. So very similar to the Pavlov example. Both of these are the presentation of food is the response. And that presentation of food is just paired with something random. That wouldn't really make the animal do that. So we have the can opener and the bell. We also have little Albert, who I think you'll probably read about next week in your chapter. But he is another one of the most famous cases. And so little Albert was essentially an experiment run on a baby, which was a really long time ago because we're not allowed to really do that anymore. With the little Albert experiment would be an ethical violation in today's time, but you know, almost 100 years ago, after Pavlov originally discovered just by accident this idea of classical conditioning, Watson ran an experiment on little Albert in which he paired a white fluffy animal, which was usually a rat or a white rabbit or something of that, with a really loud bang. And so the loud bang naturally makes the baby cry. It startles the baby and upsets them, and it's loud and terrible. And so as the baby was playing with one of these white fuzzy animals, they would play this really loud, terrible noise and make the baby cry. And after a while, just seeing the fuzzy animals would make the baby cry even without the loud noise being elicited with it. And so these are just some of the common examples. And there's a lot of examples throughout your everyday life that I want you to start paying attention to and even start thinking about now as we move through this lecture. Because at the very end of the lecture, I'm going to ask you to try and generate and come up with your own example of classical conditioning. And they're really easy to come up with because it actually happens you know, every day. And so don't go on the internet and try to look at an example. You're just going to get one of these basic examples that I've already seen and other people will provide. It's really easy to think of one in your everyday life if we understand what classical conditioning really is. So again, I want to reiterate that this classical conditioning isn't like a thoughtful procedure. There's no thought that comes into it. It's automatic conditioning, okay? So the baby wasn't thinking, oh, this rat is always occurring with this loud, terrible sound. I should be afraid of this rat. Just the fact that these two things, two stimuli, are occurring together in time is what causes the learning and the conditioning to occur. There's no thought, there's no intention. You could classically condition someone without them even wanting you to classically conditioning, because you only have to present the two things together in time. One of the things has to elicit a natural response, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so the real key to understanding classical conditioning and to meeting the learning objectives for understanding classical conditioning in this course is to really break it down by the 5 terms that were introduced to you in this chapter. And so 5 terms, it might look like a lot, especially if you were looking at all of the abbreviations for them, but it's actually really easy because these terms are just going to illustrate things and examples, and really a lot of them illustrate the same thing. And so we'll see that you will only have to really be able to identify 3 things in any given example, and you'll end up with all 5 terms. So we're going to go over each of the 5 terms and what they mean and apply these to multiple examples so that we can get some practice using the terms and being able to create examples and identify them within. So this is what classical conditioning kind of looks like. So we have before conditioning, you just have something, an unconditioned response, an unconditioned stimulus. Then you have during conditioning, we're going to pair the unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus. And then you have after conditioning. So this is after everything's occurred. And so you'll see that the terms down here that we're going to define in a second line up here. And so the easiest place to start when trying to identify these terms in an example, and we're going to start with the dog barking at the doorbell example, since we've already discussed that a bit, is to first identify the response. Okay, we're looking for the behavior that's being caused in all of these examples. And so in the dog barking example, the unconditioned stimulus is a reflexive, automatic, natural, I'm sorry, that should be unconditioned, that should be UR. We're looking at unconditioned response. So the unconditioned response is a reflexive, automatic, natural, knee-jerk response. It does not require any training or conditioning. And so if we remember back to that dog barking example, what's the behavior in that example that's being elicited naturally? It's the barking. The dog is naturally, automatically barking at something, right? Doesn't need to be trained to do that. They've evolved to do that over time, and they're born and they get old enough and they just start doing it on their own automatically. And so in this example, the unconditioned response, the UR, would be the dog barking. Then what would the unconditioned stimulus be? So this is the unconditioned stimulus. This is before conditioning. So what naturally, automatically, or without any thought, elicits the response, which is the barking, without training? So what was making the dogs bark without training? They're naturally born barking at what? The arrival of a person, right? So unconditioned, they do this automatically. They do not need to be trained to do this. It's a reflex and an automatic response. So we have the US, the unconditioned stimulus, and the UR, the unconditioned response. And we see them up here. So this is before conditioning. This is the stuff that is just already happening automatically without training and without thought. So now what we need to identify is this third term here, the neutral stimulus. And so what we can do is we can carry over the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response here, because they're going to be the same thing. We've already identified them. And so really we only need one thing here. We have to identify the neutral stimulus. So in this example, the neutral stimulus is something that did not initially or naturally elicit the response to begin with. So dogs were not born barking at the doorbell, right? So that's the neutral stimulus here. The doorbell is meaningless to dogs. They don't know what it means or what it is. So naturally, the doorbell is a neutral stimulus. But over time, when the doorbell is consistently paired with a person arriving in time, every time a person arrives, the doorbell rings. So the dog sees these, observes these occurring in time over and over again. And so that is where the conditioning occurs. And so after this happening over multiple trials, or essentially just happening multiple times, conditioning will take place. And what that involves now is identifying the conditioned response and the conditioned stimulus. And so the conditioned stimulus now is the once neutral stimulus that has been conditioned to elicit the response because it was paired with the natural stimulus or the unconditioned stimulus. And so the doorbell is now the conditioned stimulus. The doorbell didn't used to elicit barking, but now that it was paired with the guy arriving all the time, it has now been conditioned to elicit the conditioned response, which is the barking. Okay, so again, you'll see that a lot of these are occurring multiple times here. So the unconditioned stimulus is the same in both of these. The response is the same the whole time. So the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are always the same thing. So that's easy. When we're looking at examples and learning to define these terms and identify them, we're only, for each example, looking at one response, at one behavior that's being elicited. So if you can just identify the one behavior, it's going to be both the unconditioned response and then it'll become the conditioned response. I think your book technically says that these two things, the unconditioned and conditioned response, will be similar, but they're the same thing, okay? So we don't really need to differentiate. So the conditioned response and conditioned stimulus are always the same thing. The neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are also always the same thing. And so you'll see that both here, the doorbell is under the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. And so really it's taking some of these things and turning them into something else. So the unconditioned response is now the conditioned response. The neutral stimulus is now the conditioned stimulus. And that's basically it. So let's take another example now. So this example is, let's say that I've been conditioned to become nauseous at the smell of bacon because I got terrible food poisoning after eating bacon a couple months ago. So I was eating bacon, it was spoiled or whatever, and it made me really sick, nauseous, and vomit or something, okay? So the first thing that we need to do when we're identifying examples is maybe underline or pay attention to the stimuli that are in the examples and the behavior that are in the examples. So in this example, we see nausea and bacon and food poisoning. Okay, so I've kind of underlined these things here so I can start thinking about them as we try to apply this to the example. And so first, again, the easiest thing to identify is the response. Okay, remember there's only one response or behavior that we're really focusing on in each example. So in this example, what is the behavior that is automatically being elicited here? It's a reflex. It's a knee-jerk reaction to something. So what's the automatic reaction here that we're looking at? Well, it would be the nausea or vomiting. I am not conditioned to vomit to something in particular, right? But something just automatically made me nausea and throw up. So that is the unconditioned response here. That one was pretty easy to start with. Now we need to look at the unconditioned stimulus. What was the stimuli that automatically caused that unconditioned response? What was the thing that automatically caused me to become nauseous and throw up? So this might be kind of tricky. I'll give you a hint. It's not bacon, okay? Bacon doesn't naturally make people vomit. What naturally makes people throw up? Remember the variables that we underlined up here? It was the food poisoning or the bacteria that caused the food poisoning, right? And so eating the bacteria automatically caused me to throw up. I didn't have to learn that. I wasn't trained for that to happen. That was just a natural reflex that my body made. So the unconditioned stimulus here would be the bacteria, and the unconditioned response is the nausea or throwing up. So that's the first one. And now remember that we've identified those first two. We can carry them over and fill in other similar blanks. And so the response is going to be the same throughout. And so all of these responses are going to be nausea and vomiting. We also already know the unconditioned stimulus, and so we can pull that over here now too. Now what we have to identify is the neutral stimulus. So what was the stimulus that did not naturally or initially elicit the response, the nausea, but it got paired with the unconditioned stimulus? So what got paired with the bacteria? It was the bacon. So bacon doesn't automatically make people throw up. Didn't really cause any kind of reaction in me. It might have made me happy since I liked bacon. So bacon is going to be the neutral stimulus here. And so after multiple, doesn't always take multiple trials, especially stuff that's going to make you sick or make you really afraid or maybe like almost kill you or something like that. Sometimes conditioning only takes one trial for things like this. And so that bacteria was paired with bacon, and then after it was paired, I was very sick and nauseous. And so through that, the conditioning occurred. And so now we need to identify what the conditioned stimulus is in this example. So what stimulus now elicits the response that didn't initially, but now it does because it was paired with the unconditioned stimulus? Well, remember that the neutral response, the neutral stimulus, and the conditioned stimulus are always going to be the same thing by definition. And so the conditioned stimulus is bacon. So bacon didn't initially make me nauseous and throw up, doesn't automatically do that to me or to anyone, but now it does because it was paired with something that did automatically make me sick. Okay, here's another example. So let's say you squint and close your eyes. This is actually true for me. You squint and close your eyes when someone's hand just gets anywhere close to your face. You're very flinchy, okay, let's say that. When someone's hand gets close to your face because you went to an eye doctor who accidentally poked you in the eye multiple times in the last eye exam. And so now you're just really flinchy around your face because when his hand was close to your face, he ended up poking you a bunch in the eye, okay? So this is the example. Let's underline and highlight some of the variables or stimuli and responses here. So squinting and closing your eyes would be a behavior, right? Someone's hand getting close to your face is a stimuli. Poking you is a stimuli. And so now let's apply it to our terms. What is the unconditioned response here? We're always going to start with that. What was the automatic or reflexive response here? It was closing the eye. Okay, so squinting or closing the eyes. You know, if something pokes you in the eye, you're not just going to sit there with your eye wide open. You're going to automatically flinch and close your eye. It's your body's automatic response to trying to protect the eye, correct? And so the unconditioned response is squinting or closing the eye. So we can do that one, and remember that's going to be the same here and here as well. So then what is the unconditioned stimulus? What automatically or reflexively caused you to close your eye initially? So what caused that eye squint and closing the eye reflex initially? Well, it was being poked in the eye, right? You don't need to be taught to close your eye when someone pokes you in it. Your body does that without thought, just automatically. It's a reflex. So now we can carry these all over. The unconditioned stimulus is the same, and of course the response is the same throughout, everything that ends with R. So now we have to identify the neutral stimulus. So what was the neutral stimulus that didn't initially or didn't naturally elicit the response of eye closing? That would be the hand close to the face. Perhaps you've never been poked in the eye or hit in the face accidentally or whatnot. And so having a hand or something close to your face wouldn't naturally make you flinch and close your eyes, in this case at least. So the neutral stimulus is just having the hands close to the face. So now we have to identify the conditioned stimulus. And again, it's always going to be the same as the neutral stimulus because now it's just been conditioned. So it's the hand close to the face. So now you squint and close your eye anytime someone gets their hands anywhere near or close to your face. Didn't do that naturally or automatically to start with, but you've been conditioned to do that because you were poked in the eye a couple times. So there's 4 different temporal arrangements that we discuss in your book, and we'll kind of see how these examples that we've discussed here in this Edpuzzle apply to these 4 different schedules of conditioning. And so the first is delayed. And so the onset of the neutral stimulus precedes and remains present during the onset of the unconditioned stimulus. So for example, in the eye doctor example, the hand near the face preceded being accidentally poked, and then it remained there after you were accidentally poked. So the hand's near the face, he's working near your face, accidentally pokes you in the eye, and then his hand's still up there after he does it. And so the neutral stimulus was there before the unconditioned stimulus, and it was there during the unconditioned stimulus. In the bacon example, the bacon is present and being eaten before the food is actually there. Look at trace conditioning. The onset and offset of the neutral stimulus precede the onset of the unconditioned stimulus. No overlap occurs. And so this example, which is why I paused at it up here, I'm going to move it down below just a little. Because this bacon example should actually go down here. So for trace conditioning, the neutral stimulus is presented before, and then it goes away, and then the unconditioned stimulus comes after. So in the dog doorbell example, the doorbell starts and stops before the person ever enters the house. It's not like the doorbell starts before the person enters and then keeps ringing and ringing and ringing as they are walking in, unless you've got a really long doorbell, perhaps. In the bacon example, it takes a while to get sick from food, right? And so you would probably eat the bacon, and then the bacon would be gone, and then you would get sick sometime later. And so the bacon, the neutral stimulus, is present before the unconditioned stimulus, the bacteria takes effect. So that would be trace conditioning. So we have delayed and trace for the first 2, noting that the only real difference here is that there is overlap in this first one. So there's some overlap between the neutral stimulus in the US and the unconditioned stimulus, whereas there is no overlap in trace conditioning. Simultaneous conditioning is exactly what it sounds like. They occur at the same, both stimuli are presented and occur at the same exact time. So in the cat opener example, say I pull the cat opener and the can of cat food out of the drawer at the very same time. And so as the sound of the can opener is opening the food, the smell of the food is also coming from the can. And so both of these things are occurring at the same exact time simultaneously. Backward conditioning. The onset of the neutral stimulus follows the onset of the unconditioned stimulus. And so the unconditioned stimulus comes first. And none of our examples actually fall into this category. But an example that comes to mind is perhaps you've got this food poisoning already, and then you're feeling sick and feeling ill, and then you drink ginger ale after you're already sick. And so the unconditioned stimulus has already been there, it's already been present, you've already been exposed to the bacteria, and you're already sick. And then the drinking ginger ale, which is a neutral stimulus in this example, comes afterwards. You're drinking it because you're sick and not feeling well. And so since it's paired, the ginger ale neutral stimulus is paired with being sick, it gets conditioned. And so this would be backwards conditioning. And so the only difference between all of these is in what order the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are presented in, and if there's any overlap. And this is important because some of these schedules are more or less effective than others. And so when we start talking about using conditioning as a tool to train or help change behavior, being able to differentiate between the different schedules later on is going to be very helpful. And so now we want to start thinking of your own examples. And so I actually pulled most of these examples from my personal life, all of them. I'm very flinchy around my eyes. My dog barks at the doorbell. I can't stand the taste of ginger ale because I associate it with being sick. All these are examples from my life. And so I'd like you to try to think of one from your life. And so you can take a minute and pause the Ed puzzle and write down an example of classical conditioning as I did in these examples, explaining what's being paired together and what's kind of going on just generally. And then I'm going to ask you to do this on the test. And so this is an opportunity for you to try to think of an example, and then I'll provide you with feedback on this assignment and let you know if your example could apply to classical conditioning or if it would work. And so you can kind of get some feedback on what essentially will be an essay question on your test early on. And so in your example, I want you to try to now clearly identify the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. Remember that the conditioned response is the easier one to start with. It's the behavior that's automatically, the reflex that's automatically happening, the behavior that's automatically happening. Then you should try to identify the neutral stimulus. So what is the stimulus that didn't initially or automatically cause that reaction or that behavior, but that does now or will soon? And then identify the resulting conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. And so remember, this is the easiest two to identify because the conditioned response is the same thing as the unconditioned response, and the conditioned stimulus is the same thing as the neutral stimulus, assuming classical conditioning took place. So then if you can, try to decide what type of temporal arrangement your example would be. And so we just covered that in the previous slide, but you can also go back to page 120 of your book to review the 4 temporal arrangements and look at their definitions. And so which one do you think that your example falls into, and why would it qualify as that temporal arrangement? Okay, so again, I'll provide you with some feedback on your example. I made these open-ended so that Edpuzzle wouldn't mark you as incorrect or anything like that, and you can kind of get some feedback on this example as you think about it and continue to develop it for potentially a short essay question on the test. And so again, this Edpuzzle was just to cover the main tenets of classical conditioning. The next chapter, chapter 4, continues on with classical conditioning and some more terms and concepts and phenomenons behind the process of the actual conditioning. And so we're going to continue on trying to conquer this understanding of classical conditioning. So this is only the first part.